Beer is old. No shit. Some archaeologists believe mankind stumbled upon the first ferment 30,000 years ago. The first hard evidence we have is 7,000 years old and involved the Sumerians who settled in the Mesopotamian plains, which is modern-day Iran, and enjoyed a pretty robust beer culture. There's also evidence that a Neolithic brew was being enjoyed in China around this time too. Research by Travis Rupp at the University of Colorado indicates that the Sumerians eventually taught the Egyptians to brew, who then taught the Greeks, who then taught the Romans, and then this theory starts to fall apart here, and then they taught these savage tribes of Britain and Northern Europe. Not so clear on that. Regardless of who taught who, these early brews contained all manner of fruits, flowers, roots, barks, leaves, and buds, largely derived from the brewster's geographic location. Hops, not so much. More than 7,000 years of beer, and hops start to become a major player in roughly 1500 AD, which points to at least 5,500 years of non-hopped brewing. Almost 80% of that entire history. Well, what were we putting in our beer for those 55 centuries? This is a question that nudged me from being a beer drinker to a beer maker. What a wondrous, voluminous, fecund chunk of our human heritage to ponder. The answer is Grut. Grut is Old German for herb, with Old German being the first form of the German language that came into use between roughly 500 to 1050 AD. Through the 15th and 16th centuries, the meaning of Grut had morphed from the singular herb to the plural herb, specifically a blend of different plants used in bittering and flavoring ale. Fast forward 500 years, and we come to its current meaning, which is defined by a single herb, or rather a lack of it, that being hops. Grut has come to mean a category or classification of ale containing little or no hops, but much more on that later. From the 15th to the 17th century in England, the terms beer and ale both referred to fermented grain beverages. The difference was that ale did not contain hops and beer did. The advent of this hoppy beverage caused a lot of strife in Europe. For a time, some countries actually had laws against the use of hops to protect what had become a lucrative beer herb trade. Eventually, the tides changed. The use of herbs other than hops actually became illegal in some places. In 1516, Germany instituted its beer purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, setting forth a strict formula consisting of only water, malt, and hops. At this time, yeast was in there by default, but it was not formally discovered until almost 300 years later. By the 18th century, virtually all of these fermented grain beverages contained hops, so the terms ale and beer basically became interchangeable. I love this quote from Alan Eames, who is called the Indiana Jones of beer history. He says, "The classic tribal brewery was a group of women sitting in a circle, chewing grains and spitting them into a pot to form a fermentable mass. Some ambient yeast blows in, infects the stuff, and you put it away for a while, and bingo, you got beer." So, you look at all the stuff in here, and you contemplate that little quote, and wow, things have changed. For that great span of time where Grut beer was the norm, and for some of the time hops came into vogue, women brewed beer. Men just drank it. Brewing was not something novel or remotely special. It was another of the many household chores women performed. Throughout the world, from that first fermentation to roughly the 1400s, the matriarch of the family and or her female designees would have foraged for and later grown their own herbs and grains. They traded with other households and eventually farmers, often extra beer for grain. Brewsters, or alewives, as female brewers were called, provided this liquid food stuff to their families and later to family-owned taverns. Single women sold beer too. Some of them were known as cunning folk, folk healers, or witches. Just as fermented beverages have a rich and varied history throughout time and all over the world, so do folk healers. Some researchers, such as Jane Payton and Alan Eames, have concluded that much of the pop culture witch lore stems from medieval brewster practices. Apparently, and this is a little bit disputed, it's kind of really convenient, brewsters boiled and fermented in the big black copper cauldrons. They kept cats to control the vermin that were attracted by the grains they had stored. They'd hang a broom, also known as an ale stake, above their door, advertising that they had extra beer available, a practice dating back to Roman Britain. The term boiling often referred to the process of fermentation, specifically the vigorous off-gassing of CO2. Since no one knew about yeast, this boiling was regarded as magical, a power that the brewsters seemed to possess. And those tall black pointy hats, they were worn so thirsty townfolk could identify brewsters easily at busy street markets. It sounds pretty convenient, but it's interesting stuff to consider. These original home brewers, regardless of what country they lived in or what they were called, cultivated an intimate knowledge of their local plants and mushrooms. Some of them were also the first healthcare providers, as well as keepers of nature-based spirituality that guided all their practices. These three areas, nutrition, healing, and spirituality, blended when beer was used as a vehicle to ingest herbs, drawing upon the healing powers of Mother Earth. Clearly, this knowledge was not so much in the service of tasty beer as it was for the health of the village, at least initially. Some of the beers they made were not only alcoholic, but with the addition of certain mushrooms or plants like mandrake or henbane, were narcotic and psychotropic as well. Such brews were consumed, often by village inhabitants, during certain rituals and special occasions. As organized religion began to take hold throughout the world, folk healers were seen as spiritual competitors, and thus were marginalized and demonized. Christianity co-opted much of their earth-based systems and practices with male-centric reinterpretations. Physicians and surgeons began to organize into guilds and took control of healthcare, condemning cunning folk as charlatans and hucksters. Men with a nose for profit wrested brewing from the hearth, the realm of unskilled and low-caste women, and thrust it into ever more efficient collectives and later factories, the realm of skilled men. They regulated the burgeoning industry with an ever-changing series of laws and decrees from both municipal and religious authorities, oddly enough, all men. A series of political, religious, and economic changes in the 16th and 17th century Europe, particularly the Protestant Reformation, resulted in a profound shift in brewing practice. Stimulating brewed herbs were increasingly cast as dangerous adulterants, and the use of aggressive and cheaper hops were encouraged and eventually embraced. During the same period, the persecution of witches became a social phenomenon, and while there's no direct evidence of these women being killed while they were brewing, many find the timing compelling. Once again, Alan Eames described it as a, quote, suppression of women and all things feminine. Dick Cantwell, in the seminal book The Oxford Companion to Beer, reported that, quote, puritanical interdictions against the use of beer, against the use in beer of substances putatively psychotropic and aphrodisiacal, as well as the condemnation of practices of brewers as tantamount to witchcraft, helped hasten the general discontinuation of the production and use of brew. So it's out there. It was definitely a sign of the times, I guess you could say. The beginning of the end. When humanity began to farm instead of gather, some say so that they could have a regular supply of brewing ingredients, and raise livestock rather than hunt, many people began to settle together rather than roam. In this emerging lifestyle, growing degrees of specialization began to occur amongst the inhabitants. The average resident needed to know less and less about how to provide for themselves. You could barter with a neighbor or just go to the marketplace for food, goods, and services. Eventually, some villages became towns, towns became cities with significant populations, and currency came to replace the barter system, and the workforce specialization continued. Urbanites could specialize in bricklaying, metalsmithing, or brewing, and pay other professionals for the other goods and services they needed. In Europe, an unfortunate consequence of this civilizing was that water in highly populated urban regions became too contaminated to drink. Rivers and streams were utilized as sewer systems and flushed away all manner of waste downstream, populating the water with hardy strains of hostile bacteria. While their grasp of science was limited, medieval people realized that the brewing process somehow made the water wholesome again. So everyone drank beer, from grandpa and grandma to the kids. While there are ruins of ancient, relatively large-scale breweries in Europe and other sites in the Middle East, it is thought that they were in the service of temples and that this beer was consumed ritualistically during religious events and festivals. Church and state being one and the same at that time, this beer is also thought to have been the fuel and compensation for the building of the Great Pyramids. It would be centuries before large breweries began to appear in the West, once again spurred by organized religion. Starting in 4th century Europe, some of the men left society and started living communally in order to devote themselves to prayer. Roosters were not invited. These pious devotees needed their beer, and thus began the legacy of men, specifically of monks, brewing beer for each other in monasteries, some of which housed more than 100 monks. Brewing for this many people was a whole new scale of production, something a cauldron or two was not going to be able to handle. And like most brewers, the monks often had extra beer available, beer that would go bad if it sat around for too long. Like the breweries before them, they quickly realized that selling this excess was a lucrative form of income, something that the non-religious men began to take note of as well. While a small number of women were certainly involved in some of these larger-scale breweries, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s marked the final death knell for the brewster and domestic brewing in Europe and America. Production methods for goods and commodities evolved from hand methods to machines and eventually factories. The textile industry's use of steam power was a giant step, and large breweries quickly followed suit. Advancements in chemical manufacturing also brought methods to standardize brewing practices and exert a level of quality control, specifically the thermometer and the hydrometer. Later advances in storage, specifically refrigeration, as well as transportation in the form of railroads, served to foster yet another quantum leap in the growth of the commercial beer industry. I'm almost at the end. Was it all for the best? When thirst and hunger became a business, food production became industrialized. When disease became a business, healthcare became industrialized. Vast sums of money are being made at every step, from every aspect of these necessities that allow us to survive, if only marginally. Even spirituality wasn't safe. Co-opted by quote-unquote organized religion, our relationship with the supernatural has been twisted into vast revenue-generating schemes the world over. Beer has not been immune. Something profound happened when it began to be manufactured and sold in ginormous quantities. An ever-growing list of do's and an even bigger list of don'ts was established in the name of consistency, systemization, efficiency, shelf life, and ultimately the bottom line, profitability. In fairly short order, beer in all its small batch regional glory was replaced by one style almost the world over, mass-produced by a few international conglomerates. Over the past 100 years or so, we have grown thoroughly accustomed to this industrial beer. Most of the drinking public have no clue about the rich and varied history of this yellow, fizzy, homogenized stuff. No clue beyond what comes from vast football fields of machinery, circuitry, and computers. But that, thank Bacchus, is changing. Here we are in the midst of the craft beer revolution. Thank God. A phenomenon that began with some hiccups in the United States in the 80s. There are more breweries now than there were before Prohibition, and more opening every day. We're up to 60 in New Hampshire, 60 breweries. The market share of corporate lager is on the wane, while craft beer skyrockets. But 8 or 9 beers out of every 10 sold are still of the yellow fizzy factory persuasion. Another curious fact, most of these new breweries producing quote craft, artisanal, or handmade beer are getting their malt and hops and yeast from the same handful of companies to make the same styles of beers. Thankfully, there's a growing legion of new brewers who are eschewing the generic corporate malt yeast hops truck and are instead utilizing more local sources for their raw materials. They are rediscovering the merits of what is available in their particular geographic areas in lieu of stuff shipped across country or across the world. Their communities are starting to appreciate the resulting economic benefits of keeping money local by supporting regional farmers, foragers, maltsters, and hop growers. These brewers are unplugging from the corporate groupthink and reclaiming vital relationships with each other and the natural world in which we live. Oh, and they're making some pretty damn tasty beer as well. All right. There you go.